This is Space Minds by SpaceNews. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Peter Beck, CEO of Rocket Lab. We then discuss the latest news, including President Trump's new administration and what it means for space. Then we wrap up with trivia.
Sir Peter Beck, it's good to see you again. Want to just sort of jump right into this. You grew up in one of the southernmost towns in the world, right on the southern tip of New Zealand. And I remember the last time that we spoke, you were telling me like one of your sort of earliest childhood memories was walking outside under the stars with your dad and wondering if someone else might be looking back at all of us. And I was just, maybe that might be a good place for us to start, and how all of that really played into the creation of Rocket Lab and your own personal journey.
Yeah, well, I think that's like my overview effect moment. You know, as astronauts go up into orbit and they look back at Earth, they have this overview effect where, you know, all of a sudden they become very passionate about space, and I think that was a moment for me. You know, that's the earliest recollection I have of well, actually one of my earliest recollections of childhood memories actually, but certainly that was a point in time where I knew that I was going to have a career in space no matter what.
Yeah. Did he just take you out there just sort of on a regular basis? I mean, that was sort of your deal, sort of nightly strolls under the stars?
Yeah, well, he was an amateur astronomer himself, and so you know, for sure there was always plenty of discussion around the dinner table about space.
You know, in a lot of my conversations with folks, particularly, you know, former president of Sierra Space, Janet Cavande, and others, they sort of all harken back to these early times in childhood, oftentimes in places that were devoid of artificial light. And it was just sort of, it's often just sort of those indelible imprints and early memories in childhood that seem to set this trajectory towards space, because it is sort of a ponderous type of industry at its core, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree, and I think inside all of us we all have a passion, right? And it's just about, you know, discovering that passion. And some people are very lucky, like me, to discover that very early on in their life, and some people it takes a little bit longer. But you know, I firmly believe that, you know, you're all good at, everybody's good at something, and everybody has some kind of passion or desire to do something with their life. And you know, I was lucky to, like I say, lucky to find that very early.
Well, let's talk about that, because, you know, I'd love to find out sort of what drives you, because clearly it doesn't strike me. You don't strike me as the sort who's driven by money. You know, money makes things work and makes things effective and opens opportunities.
Sure.
But in interviews that I've seen you before, and just our own previous conversation, what gets you up in the morning? What's pushing you in sort of these day-to-day endeavors?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, I have an innate interest in space, but I think probably the fear of failure is you know, probably one of the driving forces, right? And you know, to be successful in this industry, you need to be somewhat paranoid, and always thinking of, you know, potential failure vectors. So yeah, look, it's you know, it's clearly something I'm passionate about, but you know, what I wake up in the morning thinking about is, you know, how can we have the biggest amount of impact possible? And you know, impact is kind of, you know, it's a function of time as well. It's kind of, you know, effort over time, and the longer that you can do it, then the bigger impact you'll have. So, you know, for me, you know, trying to build you know, an enduring space company, a multi-generational space company is super important. And while I might not be, you know, personally motivated by, you know, by my own wealth, you know, we are a public company, and in order to build a company that is, you know, is able to survive and thrive for a long period of time, you have to build a profitable company. So one of the things I think that's unique about Rocket Lab is that, you know, we're all engineers, and we love building, you know, lovely things and doing cool stuff in space. But at the end of the day, we're also very commercial. And you know, in an industry where a lot of people get very passionate about space and about technology, we are about that for sure, but equally so, we're passionate about building business and building a sustainable business that'll be around for a very long time.
InnoFlight is a leader of space-integrated avionics, enabling seamless communications, networking, cybersecurity, and processing. Unrivaled quality and cutting-edge solutions push the boundaries of what is possible in space. InnoFlight, cyber-secure space avionics.
A friend of mine, to your earlier point, a friend of mine has this comment where she says, even when things are going well, just maintain anxiety,
Yeah,
so to speak.
easy in this industry, very
Right.
easy in this industry.
Seemingly, right? But let's
Yeah.
let's talk about the engineering aspect of this, because former head of NASA Ames, Pete Warden, said you were maybe one of the best engineers he had ever met. And I've seen you sort of quoted elsewhere, particularly about Rocket Lab itself, that says there's just sort of this almost relentless focus on engineering, and that having a boss as an engineer is advantageous. And there's some natural corollaries there with SpaceX.
Mm.
So, what does that sort of mean to you in terms of both Rocket Lab, but also sort of this broader paradigm that we've seen with a lot of these new commercial space companies that are headed not necessarily by MBAs, but by engineers who are just, trying their hands at building a business in space?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good point, and I think there is a really tight couple between good engineering decisions and good business decisions, and especially in the rocket game, is that if you make a bad engineering decision very, very quickly, it's a bad business decision, because it consumes so much capital and so much time.
Yeah.
So I think that is super important, to have those correlations and be able to wear those dual hats, because what might be a suboptimal engineering decision can be the best business decision, and sometimes they're synergistic and sometimes they're in conflict, and being able to weed your way through that and chart a path, I think is super important.
But I mean,
Yeah.
maybe that's a good corollary in terms of some of the other missiles that you're developing, or rockets that you're developing, not missiles, but Neutron is obviously a big one, right? I mean, this is your medium lift launch vehicle that is eventually going to come online. I think I'd like to kind of talk about that in a broader scope, because you've talked about Rocket Lab not being a launch company and not being a satellite company, but rather a space company. And so, I'm curious, what does that mean? Where do you go from here? And so what's the broader vision?
Yeah. So, I mean, frustratingly so, it's always been incredibly clear and transparent as a pane of glass to me that, the space business is going to start to look a little bit blurry about what is a space business and what is a services business. Because, access to space is so constrained, it's so difficult to do. There's only been a few, companies that have mastered it and scaled it throughout human history. And, even today, you would think 50, 60 years on, it would be a solved problem, but yet it's still really, really challenging.
Yeah.
And I think, if you have the ability to, vertically integrate and build any spacecraft that you wish, and then go and launch it at scale and at frequency, your ability to put infrastructure, which in turn is services, in orbit is unparalleled to anybody else. And, I think, you've seen the rise of Starlink as the best example of this, right? If you're in commercial comms right now, you're not having a good time, because, Starlink has eaten everybody's lunch. And, if you stand back objectively and say, well, how could you compete with that? Well, the only way you can compete with that is if you have your own unfeathered access to space at a low cost, and your own ability to build a spacecraft at scale and at a low cost. And that's what it looks like for comms right now. And I'd say that's what it's going to look like for many, many space services in orbit.
And to that effect, in terms of just the general competitive nature, just finding those sort of collaborative environments in which you're working with other companies to kind of leverage your respective skill sets and respective infrastructure seems to be a part of Rocket Lab's kind of business model at this point, because Starlink and when you even look at Chinese comparison networks, I mean they were just so big in comparison to everybody else. That seems like just a natural tact. I guess one is that accurate, and two, if so, is that sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's true that scale in this industry is really, really important, especially when you go after those applications. And I guess our approach has been a little bit different to others. One competitor you talk about has essentially infinite access to capital, and then the other one is a government, so essentially infinite access to capital. We've never had infinite access to capital, so we have to follow Ernest Rutherford's famous saying, which is, "We have no money, so we have to think." So if you look at the way that Rocket Lab has constructed its business, we methodically went about small launch, then we methodically went about building space systems. And if you look at our space systems group, it's a lot of component systems at scale, then it's full satellites at scale. And then Neutron is kind of the last piece of the puzzle here to gain multi-ton access, high frequency cadence access to orbit. So our approach is kind of a little bit more subdued and methodical, but nevertheless our ambition remains identical at the end point.
When we talk about sort of broader infrastructure and what Rocket Lab is positioned to be in terms of just sort of a space company, you see, terms like lunar economy, cislunar economy, sort of broader questions about putting data centers up in space just by virtue of how much is being processed, and kind of, do some of that processing function in situ locales rather than kind of bringing it all back. And it really starts to speak. I mean, if trends continue in terms of just a radically different environment up there than even 10 years ago, perhaps even 5 years ago. What does that look like to you? What does it look like for Rocket Lab? But more broadly, what does it look like when you have just a lot of machinery up there, a lot of new commercial space stations up there, and potentially a lot of humans up there, both in space stations that potentially are commercially run, but also, potentially on different planets?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super exciting time to be alive. I used to always lament that I was born, out of the Apollo era, because that was going to be, historically the most significant time in human space flight, or in space flight history. Boy, was I wrong. I mean, I think now is an incredibly exciting time, if not the most exciting time. I mean, some kid from the bottom of nowhere in New Zealand can run a space company. I mean, that's craziness, right? So I think it's a super exciting time. I honestly believe the biggest thing to be done in space is yet to even be thought of, let alone executed. So I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity and ambition and excitement, in the generations to come, and we're really only getting started. Now, I will temper that with all of that promise and hope and excitement comes a lot of rubbish also. And you've seen a tremendous amount of capital flow into the space industry, and quite literally, actually, get lit on fire for no return. So it's only, the space industry, in my opinion, is a little bit short on execution. Tons of ambition and tons of kind of excitement, a little bit short on execution. But that's the way of discovering a new domain, and it's probably no different to when we first set sail on the oceans and started exploring the world. In that sense, I'm sure there was a bunch of crackpot missions that occurred out of there too. But nevertheless, the point remains. I think this is a super exciting time to be alive within the space industry, and there's a lot to come.
And that leads me to this sort of next question. So those of us who are interested in interplanetary travel, your quote unquote nights and weekends project is probably among the most exciting. I mean, it really is. I'm obviously talking to those who don't know. I'm talking about Venus and what looks to be the first private mission there. I find this almost ironic in the sense you started sort of looking up at the stars and wondering if people are looking back at us. And then this is going to be looking for signs of life, or at least, organic molecules that might be in the upper atmosphere. So Just sort of set the table for me a little bit. Tell me about that and why you're doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, really. I mean, look, I think one of the biggest questions for humanity to ask and answer is, are we the only life in the universe? And I think that's a really meaningful question to ask and answer. And if the answer is yes, then well, perhaps we should tread a little bit more carefully. If the answer is no, that's also super important. And if we look across our solar system, where are the likely probabilities to be able to find life? There's a very interesting layer in Venus's clouds. It's about 50 kilometers altitude, where there's been some discoveries of phosphine, somewhat contested. And in that particular cloud layer, it's kind of good enough to be able to support some forms of life, some extremophiles, if you will. So armed with that kind of information, we teamed up with Sarah Sager and a bunch of MIT science people, and developed an instrument called a nephelometer. And we developed a spacecraft, a cruise stage, and a probe to descend into Venus's atmosphere and take some measurements, if you will, a go no go gauge for life. And have a crack. It is a privately funded philanthropic mission. And so that's where the nights and weekends come from. We've all got real jobs to do. But I think if you can go there and you don't find life, I think that's super interesting. If you go there and you did find life, I think that answers one of the biggest questions in our history is, yes, there is other life in the universe, and I think that's important to know. But moreover, if you can find life in the clouds of Venus there, then I think you can pretty conclusively draw that life is going to be prolific throughout the universe. It's not just on Earth or not just on Venus. And I think that's also important to know.
I find it crazy that the Soviets had gone there as many times as they did, actually landed on Venus.
Yeah,
Which I
it's
don't know if most
crazy.
people know about this. It's just
Yeah.
that it didn't last long, obviously, and it certainly was not crewed by any stretch.
Yeah.
But just to do that from an engineering perspective is wild.
Massive scientific accomplishment. I mean, when you get lower in the atmosphere in Venus, it's almost like a liquid. So it can take hours for the probe to descend through these heavy, dense gases and land on the surface. You don't even need a parachute because the atmosphere is so thick that you just gently touch on the ground.
All right, that's wild. All right, last question as we sort of wrap this up. This is quite possibly the most important question of the afternoon. So brace yourself.
Oh God.
Are you a Star Wars or Star Trek guy?
Oh well, so
I only ask because I've heard this is a question they actually ask at NASA for new applicants. Right. So it's a germane question in this industry.
Either way, I'm going to offend 50% of space geeks. But so William Shatner, Captain Kirk, actually opened our New Zealand facility, and I got the chance to spend some time with him. And the most amazing person you could imagine. So by that metric, I have to say
you don't have a choice. You don't have a choice.
No.
All right, Peter Beck, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
InnoFlight is a leader of space-integrated avionics, enabling seamless communications, networking, cybersecurity, and processing. Unrivaled quality and cutting-edge solutions push the boundaries of what is possible in space. InnoFlight, cyber-secure space avionics.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
Okay, Mike, let's get into some headlines.
Sure. Well, the number one thing this week, everyone's talking about the new Trump administration, the inauguration. Yesterday, you saw Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They could have been there for a whole bunch of reasons. I know a lot of folks are pointing, hey, this is signs of new life in the Trump administration when it comes to space. But one thing that I think is really interesting, and we've heard a lot about, is what this is going to mean for the space industry. We've seen all sorts of folks, particularly in the military space community and the weather community, saying like, hey, we're expecting a new way of doing business. And they're they're really thinking that things are going to get revitalized and new ways of doing business, new players being introduced. There still have to be winners and losers. There's not going to be contracts for everyone, but it's going to be interesting to see how the mechanics of doing business have maybe changed over the next couple of years. What have been some of your takeaways from?
It's funny. I mean,
first
my
couple of
takeaways actually came before inauguration, frankly, just in terms of how bullish in the investor community seems to be on the Trump administration. And just, you see reports that, include things like SpaceX, Intuitive Machines, and Redwire. And then you punctuate it with this commentary about planting the stars and stripes on planet Mars. And it's kind of
manifest
this.
destiny.
Yeah. It's just sort of this. It almost, you don't know what to make of it, right? It's kind of, is it this brave new world in terms of space investment exploration? Is it just sort of running up the score in terms of we're going to do this and we're going to do this?
Yeah.
I don't quite know, but I think it's got a lot of people within the space community excited about it.
Yeah, and there's lots of ambition there, and I think the key will be, like in any administration, the key will be matching that ambition to accomplishments into reality and to production timelines and all the other kind of nitty-gritty that go with
But there's a question of
accomplishing big
structure
goals.
too, right? Like there's a question of structure here because we saw like even in terms of the interim administrator, like there's just confusion in terms
Yep.
of like right out of the gate out of this, who's leading what. We've got Jared obviously that still is waiting the wings to be confirmed here, but I mean these programmatic approaches to space flight and human exploration matter. They certainly do, even in this commercial structure in this sort of new age that we have. So I wonder where that rubber meets the road, so to speak, in terms of the actual efficacy of this, this new administration.
Yeah, and the last point there is I think we've seen a lot from maybe traditional space companies, legacy space companies, about how this could be done. And there's been a ton of interest, obviously, from Silicon Valley. And how will they do that? And just quite frankly, Washington and Silicon Valley don't do things the same way. And so someone's going to have to bend or someone's going to have to break, and it's going to be done differently.
But now that you have somebody actually who's, maybe not from Silicon Valley now, obviously down in Boca Chica and in Hawthorne, but you've got more of that integration within the space industry.
Yep.
With Elon Musk having an office on the White House grounds. I don't know that in recent memory, at least, that we've had, someone who is such in charge of such a behemoth amount of space contracts that also had an office right there in the White House. So, questions of conflicts of interest sort of loom large in this. But, I think maybe transitioning here, one of the interesting things is that there's just been a lot of news that this week and last week about space. We had those two robotic lunar landers, one from Firefly, the other one from the Japanese company iSpace, making a bid for the lunar surface. You got Intuitive Machines at the end of February. So, I mean, what are you thinking about in terms of this so-called lunar economy that's developing?
Well, I think, and it kind of goes back to our last discussion too, right? Like, is this happening? Like, is this a reality? Are we making progress towards, like you just said, a lunar economy? Is that a couple years ago, that was kind of a laughable term, right? Like a lunar economy, what does that mean? And like, is that the bits of moon rock I can buy at a museum store? No, it's like, it's this huge tens of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars already in what's being spent. So I think the question there is like, is this real? Yes, it seems to be. This last week shows even more so. It's very real. And then the question just becomes, how much more spending is going to follow, and how quickly it's going to happen.
I thought, well, I mean, to your point, I got the sense that when I heard the term lunar economy, Washington and various industries love to throw around their sort of nonsense terms that, get investors excited and, so this galvanizing moment and a new Copernican revolution that's going to take hold and, change our focus and sense of our own place in the universe. And, a lot of that's exciting and a lot of that's, you wonder if it's BS or not. But I remember I was talking to a few people at the Pentagon and they made a point that's hard to argue with, in the sense that if China is there, which it seems very clear, the Chang'e missions, especially the Chang'e, I believe 7 coming up next year, there's going to be an economy that follows, but at least by virtue of some of the federal contracts that the U.S. and other rivals and adversaries are going to be sort of looking to. And so that sort of ratcheting up on either side in and of itself might create sort of the downstream effects that lead to the kind of economy that we're actually talking about. And then that coupled with the idea of going to Mars, I mean, it's a pretty exciting time.
Well, and to add to that, I think if China's there, like the U.S. certainly wants to, there's absolutely no appetite to be second to the Chinese in anything right now. So one other thing that happened last week that is obviously part of all of this excitement, I think, is the New Glenn launch too. What were some of your takeaways from that? Because, you know, what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing, there's an awful lot of enthusiasm from the space community for that. And I think part of it's driven just by they want to see competitors. They want to see signs of a healthy space economy. And when there's someone else besides SpaceX, they feel like, hey, this really is taking off how we're expecting. It's not just one or two or three players. It's going to be many, many players.
I mean, I think that is the significance really of New Glenn, in the sense that when we talk about LEO, we talk about GEO, low Earth orbit, geostationary orbit. There's a question of, you know, who takes us there, and for the longest time, it's been the Falcon 9, Falcon Heavies, which are sort of the workhorse of the SpaceX fleet. I mean, increasingly they're developing Starship, which is, you know, it's got everybody sort of excited just in terms of the volume that craft can take, and the cargo capacity that the craft can take into space. But, you know, when you have a single reliance, an overwhelming reliance on just one single company, it makes a lot of people nervous. It makes, you know, disruptions sort of more vulnerable.
And we saw that when SpaceX started. There was nervousness about, like, oh, is there room for a player? And SpaceX ended up being that player.
Yeah. But I mean, now you're talking about a little bit more diversified space, and it's not just New Glenn, right? I mean, Rocket Lab is also sort of moving into sort of that rival territory with their neutron rockets. So, you know, it's just, you know, every year people say this, right? Like, this is the year for their respective industry. I think this year actually is, when it comes to space, not only in terms of what New Glenn represents, not only in terms of like the lunar capacity of these various companies, but that coupled with the fact that you have a man in the White House, sort of the so-called buddy in chief, that is at the helm of a new administration that has, in the inauguration, made a mention of planting human footprints on Mars. That's remarkable. I mean, statements like that are big, but when it comes in the inaugural address of a new presidency, you gotta take notice.
Yeah. The other thing I'd add to that is last year we saw more launches than we've ever seen before, and the global space economy grew maybe just a few percentage points, but still largest it's ever been. So yeah, a lot going on. It's going to be a big year.
Space Loop. Let's close the loop with trivia and audience perspective on this week's space news.
Well, NASA said this week, this is a bit of trivia for all of you watching at home here. They said this week that astronauts aboard the ISS were set to swab the exterior of the station for microbial life. Microbial life in space. If that doesn't get your interest, I don't know what will. But here's the question, and you'll be able to see this, see the answer on some of our social accounts if you follow those. But what is the primary goal of that? Or perhaps what is the more realistic endeavor of that experiment? Is it A, to test the growth of crops in space? You know, everybody watched The Martian with Matt Damon, and they saw him growing potatoes in the Martian landscape. Is it B, to examine whether spacecraft release microorganisms and how they behave in space? Is it C, to study the effects of space radiation on bacteria? Or is it D, my favorite, to find new forms of life on the moon? Pay attention to our social channels, and you'll be able to find the answer there, and we'll also make mention of it in our subsequent podcast.
That's I have no idea. I'm going to have to think hard on that one. The one other item I'd add is we spent a lot of time talking about what we expect from the Trump administration. We want to hear what you're thinking about, where you think there could be giant leaps and bounds and where there may be setbacks and where there could be some surprises. So email us at spaceminds@spacenews.com and we'll read some of the most interesting answers on the podcast in the next couple of weeks.
That's right. And if you have topics or guests that you think we should be speaking to, also let us know. But that's it for us. I'm David Ariosto.
I'm Mike Gruss.
And thanks for joining us here on Space Minds.